Hi, I'm your host, Bob Powell. We're proud to welcome you to the Exceptional Advisor podcast series brought to you by the Investments and Wealth Institute. This series aims to help you to better serve your clients, differentiate yourself from the competition, and enhance your ability to communicate those differences. My guest today is Warren Berger, who refers to himself as a questionologist, and he's the author of several books, including A More Beautiful Question. So welcome to the podcast, Warren.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. Now, before we get going, for the benefit of our listeners who may not be familiar with you and your work, do you mind giving us a brief overview?
Yeah, sure. Well, I was a longtime journalist. I used to write for New York Times, Wired magazine, and various publications. So I was always used questioning as a journalist. And then about 10 years ago, I started to think about questioning in a different way. I started to think about how it could help people in business, how it could be a big part of innovation if you were asking the right questions, and how it can help you communicate with both with clients and customers and with people in your personal life as well. So I started to get really into the idea of questioning, and I wrote a book about it called A More Beautiful Question, which then led to two more books on questioning. And so now I call myself a questionologist because that's all I study. That's basically what I'm totally focused on.
So you getting into questioning, obviously, as a journalist, that's your key function is to ask questions. And I, too, am a journalist, so I pride myself, hope, on asking mostly good questions. And we just interviewed Dan Solon, who wrote a book called Ask. So the topics are complementary, I think. And I mentioned,
great.
Yeah. I mentioned to him a story that I'm so fond of telling, which was about a Nobel Prize winner who, when asked, to what did he credit winning the Nobel Prize, and he said that his mother used to send him off to school.
That's right.
Not with this advice, give good answers, but ask good questions.
Yeah. Yep. Oh, yeah. I've used that quote many times. It's a great quote. I use that a lot when I go to schools, or when I'm talking to educators about how, you really have to encourage questioning. And that's a great example of encouraging questioning, just to say to your student or your child, or, did you ask a good question today?
Yeah. So talk more about the surprising things that you've learned as you think about the power of questioning.
Yeah. So I guess, I started off thinking about questioning as a journalist. So I always thought it was this great tool for like extracting information from people, which it is. But what I learned is, there's so many things that you can do with questioning. First of all, you have to think of questioning really as two kinds. There's the kind of questions you ask other people, and then there's the questions you ask yourself. And they're very distinct. And so what I discovered was that if you look at successful creative people, innovators, business leaders, they're asking both kinds of questions really well. And when it comes to the questions they ask themselves, they're asking the kind of questions that open up their thinking or that give them something to focus on and pursue. What if we could come up with a better way to do this? They're asking questions that help them identify problems or things that might not be going right, let's say in the company or in their relationship with a customer. So they're asking questions like, why are we having this challenge? And they will begin to focus on that question. And then when they're communicating with other people, it's sort of a different function. Now you're trying to, either inspire people, learn from them, collaborate with them. You're trying to figure out the right kinds of questions that will create that rapport with people. That to me was the big aha moment, was not so much about the questions you ask other people, but about the questions you ask yourself and how that is absolutely, it's like central to innovation. If you look at innovators, they're definitely asking those questions. And a lot of times you take a breakthrough that happens in business, you trace it back to its origins, you'll find somebody was asking a question or a series of questions that triggered the whole thing.
Yeah. So when you think about these questions that people ask of themselves, what came to my mind was things like, what could I be doing better? What could I be doing differently? What should I stop doing? What should I be doing more of? I mean, are there some sort of key questions that people can take away from our conversation today that they could incorporate into their lives?
I'm a big believer in the three big questions, which are why, what if, and how. These are big, open-ended. So they're not full questions. They're really just the stems, they're the stem of a question, and then you build onto it, you add something onto it. But those three question stems are at the root of solving problems. So if you can use those three types of questions together and sequentially, in that sequence of why, what if, and how, you can tackle all kinds of problems. And again, I talked about the relationship between questioning and innovation, or questioning and breakthroughs. When I studied this in my book, or in my books, I would look at, kind of how Netflix started, or how Airbnb started, or how someone invented the microwave oven, or whatever. And I was finding a lot of times they were cycling through those types of questions. They start by asking why. So when you're asking why, you're kind of looking at a problem or a situation, and you're trying to figure out, why does it exist? Why isn't this working as well as it should? Then you don't want to get too hung up on why questions. You don't want to stay there forever. You want to move on to questions that are now going to help you start to think about solving the problem. So you're asking, what if? What if we tried this? What if we tried that? And then ultimately you're trying to get to how questions. How do we do it? How do we get started? How much is it going to cost us? So I find if you use those three types of questions in your life, it's a really great it's a great problem solving tool, and it works in almost any situation or almost any challenge that you may be dealing with, both in your work, in your business, and in your life in general.
Yeah. So when you think about leaders, maybe in the business world or in other venues, who comes to mind when you think about people who have done that especially well, ask these questions? What came to my mind was I'm looking at my phone, and Edwin Land, the founder of Polaroid,
Yeah.
asked, how do we get instant photography? And
right.
Lo and behold, I think he would be so thrilled to see, photographs from your phone, right?
Yeah, well, Edwin Land is an interesting story. I talk about him a lot in my work. And, the initial question that triggered everything for Edwin Land wasn't actually asked by him. It was asked by his 4-year-old daughter.
Right. Yeah.
And he was taking a picture with a camera. This is back in the 1940s, taking a picture with a standard camera. And of course, in those days, you had to send the film out. It took a long time.
Yep.
Maybe a week later or something, you'd actually see the picture. So he took a picture of his 4-year-old daughter,
Yep.
and then he said, well, we have to wait to see the picture. And she asked him, why do we have to wait for the
Yep.
picture? And so Edwin Land was very taken with this question. And, this is part of the power of questions, is that someone asks you the right question, it can suddenly change the way you think about something. And that's what happened here. His daughter asked him that, and he started to then, almost embrace that question and say, yeah, why do we have to wait for the picture? And what if you didn't have to wait? What if you could somehow take that dark room and put it inside the camera and, have the pictures get developed in there? And that led to the instant camera. And so if you look at now moving ahead to more recent times, a guy who was really very inspired by Edwin Land was Steve Jobs at Apple. Mm-hmm. And Jobs had the same approach with questioning. Jobs would ask why about everything. And he would go through the company at Apple, and he'd go through every department, and he'd ask people, why are we doing it this way? Why are we using this method? Why are we using this approach? And of course, people tend to say, when you ask them that, they'll sometimes just say, oh, well, that's just what we've been doing. We've been doing it that way for the last 10 years, 15. And of course, he did not want to hear that, because that's saying to him, you're just operating on autopilot. Mm-hmm. You're just doing what you've always done. He did not want that. He wanted people to always be thinking, why are we using this approach? What if we tried something different? Have we really looked at the alternatives? Are we staying up to date on what's happening and what's changing? So he's, to me, is a model example. But I find lots of leaders, out there who are really, really good questioners. And more leaders are starting to realize they have to do that they can't be the answer guy anymore. That as a leader, they also have to be the kind of, if you will, the questioner in chief for the organization.
So when you think about the challenges of becoming a good questioner, two things come to mind. One is leaders are presumably think they have to be the answer man, so they're not maybe inclined to ask questions. And the other is it may not be innate for many people, right? Asking questions, it might be a sign of lack of knowledge or
a weakness,
right? Or a weakness,
Yeah, I think it is innate in a way, because if you look at children, Children are all really good questioners. So we kind of have it in us, the ability to question. But what happens is it gets tamped down over time. And a lot of things do that. Social pressure is a big thing. People are just, they start to get a little nervous about asking questions for all kinds of reasons. They may think that they're overstepping their bounds. They may be afraid they're going to ask an obvious question or a stupid question. So it causes them to really hold in their questions. And I think that's one of the big things for leaders is to have the confidence to be able to ask questions and not feel that it's going to make you look weak. Because it really doesn't make you look weak. That's sort of in our heads. We think that, the smartest people really are great questioners. Albert Einstein was one of the greatest questioners of all time. And so, this idea that this questioning equals weakness is really it's a false equation. And so as a leader, you have to have the confidence to say, I'm going to show my curiosity to people. I'm going to be honest. I'm not going to say I have answers to things that I don't have answers to, that maybe nobody has answers to. I'm going to be honest about that. And I'm going to use questioning as a way to get everybody sort of on the same page with saying, hey, we're all asking this question together. This is the question we're pursuing as a company or as a team. And so, it's okay for me as the leader to ask this question because I'm trying to rally all of you around this question too.
I mentioned earlier, I was reading this book about General Washington during the Revolutionary War, and he would hold conferences with his, second in commands and ask them, what should we do? Should we cross the Delaware? Should we attack Trenton? Should we? And it struck me that he was.
Yeah. So generals, military generals, I was called in recently by the U.S. Army, and they wanted me to talk to their graduating officers. And at first I thought I was really surprised because I thought, I don't think of the Army as the place where this message would necessarily about questioning would necessarily resonate, because I think of it as an orders driven culture, but that's not the case. That, what I was told is that, as a leader, yes, you definitely have to give orders, but you also have to be asking questions all the time of yourself and of the people around you. And you have to be having that kind of curious mind at all times in order to adapt to the circumstances. So, it's important even for military people.
Yeah. So as you know, the bulk of our audience will be investment advisors, folks who work in brokerage firms and mutual fund firms, insurance companies, et cetera. And you talk about how questioning can help with relationships, both in their personal and business life. I'm curious if you can sort of maybe talk first about how our audience can use their questioning in their business life with their prospects and their clients.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
and their colleagues, right, and their peers,
right.
Workplace. Yeah.
I think anyone who is in the business of advising people, coaching people, consulting with people, has to embrace questioning big time. Because what happens is if you're in that kind of an advisory role and you get into the habit of giving people answers, it can be problematic because number one, you might get blamed for those answers. But also it just is not as effective in convincing people of something. It's much more effective if you can sort of work with them and lead them to have this conclusion along with you. Like if you have a vision for what someone maybe should be doing with their financial planning, it's better if you can sort of arrive at that vision together with your client, as opposed to you just saying, here's my vision for what I think you should be doing. So anyone who's in that position of advising has to figure out, how do I use questioning as a means of collaborating? How do I use questioning as a means of getting somebody to be on the same journey with me, and together we're kind of figuring out what's the best way to go here.
So as you think of maybe of some sample questions, some that come to mind would be, what do you envision a successful retirement to be? Or
yeah, exactly.
Right.
You might even start with more basic stuff like, what is your passion in life now and in the years to come? And you're sort of getting a sense of what really matters to them, what they're looking for. You could be asking them about, what's the thing you're most proud of in terms of your accomplishments, because all of that may play into the kind of larger vision that they have for their retirement. And then, yeah, definitely questions where you're asking them to sort of put themselves ahead into the future and kind of envision what they want to happen, what they see as an ideal situation. You want them to think about potential obstacles. You want them to ask about offbeat ideas. That's really important too, because one of the things I say to people is one of the great things you can do with questioning is get people to explore options that they might not have thought of otherwise.
Mhm.
Don't be afraid to push people with questioning a little bit, to say, one of the favorite questions that you can use as any kind of a coach, a very simple question, it's called the AWE question, AWE, which is just stands for and what else. So when someone is thinking about something and coming up with ideas, you should be pushing them to think about it deeper. Say, and what else? Okay, you're envisioning this kind of a scenario. What else do you see happening there? You want to do X, Y, and Z, but what else might you want to do that we haven't talked about yet?
Yeah.
So you're with questioning, you're trying to get people to go a little deeper into their own imagination and to just open up possibilities that might not come to mind right away.
Yeah.
And that's one of the best things you can do with questioning, because now you're bringing all the ideas to the surface, and then you can start to choose and pick which ones make the most sense. And then, eventually you want to use questioning to get really practical and say, okay, we've thought about all these visions and these ideas and these possibilities. How might we get started on that? What should we be doing now to make that possible in the future? And what can we be doing each step of the way?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the way I like to think of questioning. It's kind of like you start big and broad, and that's what why questions are. They're these sort of big philosophical, broad questions. But by the end, you're getting very practical with your questions. How are we going to do this? How are we going to do that?
Yeah.
And while you're doing this, one more thing, I really like the phrase, how might we? How might we is, I say those, like, I think of those as the three words that innovators use, the secret phrase that innovators use, but it's also great for anyone who's working with a client, a customer on trying to create a solution of some kind. If you're asking how might we, you're creating this perfect collaborative situation where you're saying, we're going to sit down together and we're going to think about how might we do this and how might we do that. And we're going to explore possibilities.
Yeah.
That's what how might we is all about. It's collaborative exploration. You and somebody else are, working together to figure something out or find solutions. So think about using that phrase as you're working with clients.
Yeah.
Phrasing a lot of things in terms of how might we.
Yeah. It's interesting in the world of investment advice, there's a trend referred to as goals-based planning. And there's much debate around goals-based planning where advisors are saying, we're going to help you, Mr. and Mrs. Client, achieve your goals. But the criticism of that approach has always been, well, clients don't always know their goals and can't articulate them. But I see a world in which someone might say, how might we help you achieve, if this is your goal, how might we get there? That it would be a way to sort of get them to sort of articulate what the goal might be and then feel like there's a collaborative approach to achieving that goal.
That's what we're talking about. You have to start with wherever that sort of broad thing is. And it may be that they haven't, really nailed down what the goals are, what the visions are. So that's where the questioning starts. And then after that, it moves to the more practical, what's the plan? What are we going to do? But first, you got to figure out, why are we doing this? What's it really all about? What are you really trying to achieve here?
Yeah. I had an old boss, I'll throw this out your way and you can tell me whether it's a good question or not, but he used to like to ask people, what keeps you up at night? And that would be the one thing that, at least if they could articulate that would be, if you could solve that problem, then you solve what keeps them up at night.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a very powerful question. It's not my favorite question though, because it does sometimes have a little bit of negativity to it.
It does.
Like, I really prefer to be focused in on what people are passionate about.
Yeah.
And if you can phrase questions around that, that's a little more, kind of positive. But you do want to figure out what the issues are, what the challenges are. So maybe, I would probably tend to, rather than keep you up at night, I would tend to be phrase it as what are the challenges you see to achieving this goal or whatever. So slightly less anxiety ridden language. I'm a big believer in there's a whole philosophy called appreciative inquiry,
Yeah.
which is really about, when you're asking questions, just try to use the most positive framing of the question that you can, because the same question can be asked two different ways and it'll have a totally different reaction. And if it's framed as a negative question, sometimes it'll shut people down. But if it's framed as a positive question, it'll tend to open people up more.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, some people aren't trained to be good questioners. How do you get better at it? I mean, is there a script that people should follow? Obviously, they should read your books, but
you know, I feel like you can use scripts, and there are times when it's appropriate to script out, like with a client, some of the things you may want to ask them. However, you never want to be reading from a script when you're with a client or having a conversation with people. So what you need to do is, rather than working from a script, you need to think about the kinds of questions you might want to ask. And a lot of this is really stuff you figure out for yourself. It's not like, you need to bring a questionologist expert in to write down all your questions for you. You really are going to figure them out for yourself if you spend enough time on it. And by the way, you get better at questioning the more you do it. So the more you practice this approach of thinking about lots of questions for your client, the better you're going to get at formulating those questions. And you're going to see from firsthand experience which ones work and which ones don't, which ones tend to resonate and in this situation and which ones don't. So it's really a matter of, taking the time to think in advance of any kind of meetings or communication with clients. Think in advance about the kinds of questions you should be exploring with them. Write those questions out, get them embedded in your head. And then when the time comes that you're going to meet with them, kind of throw the script away
yeah,
because you want the engagement to be very conversational. But hopefully you will have those questions now in your brain and you'll be able to pull them out just at the right moment when they're needed. When the conversation seems to be moving in that direction, you've got the question ready to go.
yeah,
So that's the approach I tend to recommend.
yeah. As people are asking questions, they may have been instructed to be an active listener. Is that advice that you
Yeah.
give folks? Yeah.
Yeah, I think listening is like a big part of the whole equation with questioning because, and again, this is part of why you don't want to be reading off a script, because if you're just asking questions off a script, it looks like the whole thing is prepared and it may look like you're not listening. It may seem as if, you've just got this thing all planned out. So you want to have questions in your head, but then you want to be listening and you want to be tailoring your questions to what the person has just said. You want to be reacting and responding to things that they've said. And listening is really just about holding back your own desire to jump in. Sometimes you just got to let people say what they need to say, and you've got to show interest, and you've got to follow up. The follow-up question is a really, really important tool. Follow-ups can be as simple as, tell me more about that, or, let's go a little deeper on that. Or it can be that question I mentioned earlier, the awe question, AWE. And what else? You said you like this. What else can you tell me about that?
Yeah.
So you're just trying to dig a little deeper. Sometimes to show that you're listening, you may want to do. There's a technique called paraphrasing, where you will just simply say, what I'm hearing you say is you're concerned about this, this, and this. What do you think about that? Or tell me more about why that concerns you. So you're doing that just as a way to show people that I hear you, I'm listening, I'm absorbing what you're saying. You're also doing that, by the way, just in case you're hearing it wrong. You say to people, what I'm hearing you say is XYZ. They'll correct you if you got it wrong. And so that's a good tool that way too. So definitely, show that you're a listener, tell people that you're hearing them, and that's a big part of the questioning process. Then build your questions off of what you're hearing them tell you.
Yeah. It's interesting as you're chatting, I'm sort of smiling to myself. I'm watching for the very first time The Sopranos and watching Tony Soprano with his psychiatrist as she poses
Yeah,
questions to him saying,
right.
tell me more about that, or why do
Yeah.
you hate your mother so much? Or
Yeah, yeah. Well, psychiatrists are great examples of really good questioners. And, what psychiatrists do is something that I think a lot of financial advisors should do, or a lot of consultants should do. Psychiatrists don't or rarely tell you what to do.
yeah.
They help you figure it out for yourself, you know? So when the psychiatrist is talking to Tony Soprano, she's not saying, "Hey, Tony, here's what you should do." She is getting Tony to, try to figure it out for himself. And everyone should be doing more of that and less of the advice giving or telling,
Mm.
because the advice giving, it can be risky. You may be giving people the wrong advice. And also, people don't respond as well to being told what to do as they do figuring it out for themselves. If they come to an epiphany themselves, that's going to have way more impact than you telling them what to do.
Yeah. So are there other things that people should watch out for when they're asking questions? We talked about sort of framing
Yeah.
things negatively and this, of course. Anything else?
Yeah, I think just in general, keep in mind that questioning can be perceived as confrontational.
Mm-hmm.
It is a challenge sometimes. You're challenging people. When you ask a question, you're sort of, at least from their perspective, you're sort of questioning them.
Putting them
Like
on the
maybe
spot almost, right?
yeah, they may think of you as questioning their expertise or questioning their common sense, or
Yeah. Right.
so you do have to be careful about how you question. Some people say that you should ask direct why questions of people. I don't really buy that necessarily. I like asking why. It's one of my favorite questions, so I don't want to take it off the table. But I do think just be careful, especially if you're asking why questions. Be careful about how you phrase it and the tone you use. There's simple things you can do, like, before you ask someone, why are you doing this? Why are you doing things the way you're doing them? Just put the phrase, "I'm curious about something," in front of it. And maybe even on the end of it, explain why you're asking. So instead of saying, "Why are you doing it that way?" you say, "I'm wondering about something. I'm wondering why you take that approach. And the reason I ask is, I have a similar challenge myself sometimes, and I'm wondering if this would work for me too." So you see, when you do that, you have now taken the edge off that question. When it was just, "Why are you doing this?" it may have seemed like a criticism or a judgment.
Mm-hmm.
But by showing that it's coming from curiosity and there's a reason you're asking, by putting that curiosity and that rationale onto the question, think of it almost like a question sandwich, right? You've got curiosity at the beginning, you've got rationale at the end, and the question is in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
So by doing that, you've kind of made the question easier for the person to accept. They are less likely to see it as criticism or a challenge or a threat in some way. In general, soften your questions when necessary and make sure to show they're coming from a good place. Good questioning comes from curiosity. So try to let people know that's where your questions are coming from. They're coming from your curiosity, your desire to learn, your desire to get better.
So, Warren, we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, I've got a host of questions around some of your recent tweets and some of the blogs that have been published in the Harvard Business Review and Fast Company and other places.
Sounds good.
Behavioral science provides advisors the keys to facilitating change and the ability to shape client behavior. If you are new to behavioral finance or want to learn more about how to apply new strategies to counsel your clients, join us on October 3rd at the Omni King Edward Hotel in Toronto, Canada, for a one-day workshop, Facilitating Sustainable Behavioral Change. To learn more, visit www.investmentsandwealth.org.
All right, Warren, we're back. And if you're ready, this will be like a round robin of questions around things I've read on your Twitter account and also blogs that you've published here and there. So when we last left off a second ago, you were talking about expressing that you would be curious. You were asking the questions out of curiosity. What about empathy? Does that play a role in describing what you're doing too?
Yeah, I think the big thing with questioning is, particularly when you're questioning other people or questioning your clients or whatever, you always want to be thinking about the question from their point of view. So as you're thinking of questions you might ask someone, take the time to step back and think, okay, what would I think if I were in their shoes and I were being asked this question? That will help you to see where there might be some trouble spots. Maybe a question is a little too aggressive. You want to work on that, the wording or the phrasing of that to soften it a little bit or something like that.
So the thing that you just sort of triggered in my mind is this notion of you as the advisor asking questions of your client or prospect. What about the opposite, to encourage your client to ask questions of you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's definitely, you should be doing that every step of the way, and let them know that, every question is welcome, and that the questions really help, that they help to move things forward. They help to clarify, on both sides. You should always kind of have that out there and say it at the beginning of a conversation and say it again at the middle of the conversation and then say it at the end.
Yeah.
A lot of times people just save it for the end, and when they're all done, they'll say, okay, any questions? And the problem with doing that is by that time, there's been too much information, absorbed by the person, and they don't even know where to begin to ask a question. So probably better to break it into stages, and at the end of each sort of section of talking about something, try to solicit a question from them about, do they agree? Do they understand what we just talked about, what in there makes sense to you and doesn't make sense to you? What are you responding well to and what are you having issues with? So you do that at each chunk of an interaction, and rather than waiting until the end.
Yeah. In one of your tweets, you have a fondness, as I do too, for George Carlin.
Yeah.
Talk more about your fondness for George.
Yeah, well, George Carlin's someone I've always admired. And then when I was working on the questioning book, I got really deeply into his work because I was looking at the kinds of people who are very good questioners. And one of the things I discovered to my surprise is that comedians are, I knew scientists were really good questioners, and I knew certain other types of people, inventors, entrepreneurs. I knew they were good questioners, but it really surprised me to learn that comedians are excellent questioners. A lot of them build their whole comedy routine around observing everyday life and then questioning what we do and why do we do it. And particularly George Carlin was kind of a master of that. He would look at all the idiosyncrasies. He would look at the language that we used and all of the things that didn't make sense. And so he was really great at identifying and jumping on things that didn't quite connect or make sense. And then his point is, why are we, why? Well, this doesn't make sense. Why are we doing this? And he did it in a way that was very funny. But what I once wrote about in the Harvard Business Review is that Carlin and an innovator like in Silicon Valley are like two sides of the same coin. In a weird way, they're related.
Yeah.
They're both looking for things that don't make sense. Yeah. And the difference is, Carlin, the comedian, is simply commenting on it. The innovator is trying to change it. The innovator sees the same thing. Carlin sees, this doesn't make sense. Can I change it? Can I invent something that will make people do things in a more sensible way? And it's an interesting relationship when you look at it that way.
Yeah. There's another blog that you wrote about why a mission question is perhaps more important than a mission statement. Yeah,
this is something I'm pursuing with a lot of the companies that I talk to is the idea that, and it's a radical idea to propose to a company. Most of them are kind of just laugh me out of the room when I do it. A couple of them have taken it very seriously and are looking into doing it. And so what I'm saying to them is maybe you should think about replacing your company's mission statement with a mission question. The reason I say that is because what I've found from my research is that questions are much more engaging than statements. They're much more forward-looking than statements. And so, for example, if your mission statement, the example I like to give is, let's say you are a robotics company and your mission statement is something like, we make the world a better place through robotics. That statement is probably not going to be super engaging to people. It kind of sounds like a slogan or something, you know? If you simply were to take that phrase I like, how might we, and put that at the front of it, and you say, how might we make the world a better place through robotics?
Yeah.
What you've done is you've changed the whole tone of the statement. You've opened it up. You've taken some of the baloney out of it. It does, because you're not making this claim anymore. And you're making it very forward looking, which a mission should be. A mission,
Yeah.
you shouldn't feel like a mission has already been accomplished. Otherwise, what's the point?
Right.
So mission statements or mission questions should always be about the future, right? It's like, this is the road we're on. This is what we're trying to do. So, you know, my point to companies is that if you want to get that feeling out of a mission statement, you want it to be engaging, you want it to invite people, you want them to think of it as a journey they're on. If you want that, you're better off having it as a question than a statement.
Yeah. You wrote another blog about questions that can change your life, and it was titled, "Where's My Tennis Ball?" Caught my attention.
Right. Yeah, that came from, believe, the founder of one of the Silicon Valley founders, I think the guy who started Dropbox. And I was just collecting questions that people use to motivate themselves and to help find their purpose. And he said he liked to ask himself, what's my tennis ball, or where's my tennis ball? And he said, because he liked to think of himself as a dog that's chasing a tennis ball. He said, if you look at a dog that's chasing a tennis ball, they're not paying attention to anything else. You know, the only thing that matters to them is that tennis ball. And he said, that's what, you know, when you're trying to figure out your purpose, you're trying to figure out what is the thing that I can be totally focused on. So I do collect questions like that. You know, another question that I took from Silicon Valley, very popular there, is, what would we attempt to do if we could not fail? So the idea being, you know, let's say we take failure off the table and we act as if there's no way we could fail. What would we try to do then? What bold thing would we try to do? And it's a really interesting question, because by taking that failure away, you kind of open up your imagination and you get bolder and you get bigger with your ideas. And then, of course, with those kinds of questions, you have to at some point return to reality, because failure is a possibility. But just that brief period of thinking that way can open up ideas, and it can really create thoughts that you wouldn't otherwise have. So I like that question, because it just kind of creates this artificial moment where you open up your imagination and your thinking.
Yeah.
And you might think of ideas you wouldn't otherwise have.
So on the first question of where's my tennis ball, I'm reminded of Jim Collins' Good to Great, where he talked about being a hedgehog. I'm not sure if you're
yes.
Jim Collins,
right?
But,
yeah,
be singularly focused on that one thing that you do and do well. Yeah. Are you familiar with George Kinder by chance? Does that name ring a bell? He's in the financial planning world, and he talks about asking 3 questions of clients, and I don't have them all here, but one of them has to do with this notion that imagine your doctor shocks you with the news that you only have 24 hours to live, and ask yourself, what did you miss doing? What did you not get to be? What did you not get to do in life? And it sort of helps people sort of really
absolutely
hyper focus on the things that are really
and you know, I'm so fond of those kinds of questions that I've actually come up with a label for them, and I call them constraint questions. And what I mean is, you either take a constraint and you put it on the question, or you take a constraint off a question. So an example of putting a constraint on is to say, what if we only had 24 hours to live? That's the 24-hour constraint, and it forces you to think differently. You could go in reverse and say, you're trying to create a product, and apparently Jobs used to do this at Apple, and you say, what if we had all the money in the world? What if the budget didn't matter? We could do whatever we wanted. So that's taking the constraint off, you know, and saying, and the same with my failure question, that what if you couldn't fail? that's taking the constraint of failure off.
Yeah.
So you can do really interesting things with constraint questions by either putting a constraint on or taking a constraint off. What you do is you create this kind of artificial reality where your brain thinks differently and will come up with other ideas and other possibilities, or it will force you to really focus in a way that maybe you wouldn't otherwise focus on.
Yeah. We've talked about questions that folks should ask, and then we've also talked about some of the questions a leader should never ask. Are there others that we haven't, that are still out there?
The one question I urge leaders to avoid is, whose fault is this? or, who screwed up here? Because you want to be getting away from those sort of blame questions. Another question I hate that a lot of leaders ask is they ask in this kind of resigned tone, haven't we tried this before? Or, hasn't this already been done? What I have an aversion to are those sort of negative questions that take the air out of the room, that put it like a pin in the balloon.
Yeah.
I have a problem with those kinds of questions.
Yeah. Well, what about in cases where, there is a failure and someone says it's not about the blame, but what went wrong and how do we avoid it from happening again, right? And then is that legit?
Yeah, it is. Although I would play with the wording of it as much as possible, where you sort of might say, if something has gone wrong in a situation, you might look at what went right and start with that.
Yeah.
And start with, okay, in this situation, let's talk about what went right. And then from there, you transition into what went wrong.
Yeah.
And when you do that, you're sort of getting people off to a good start.
Yeah.
And you're
because
building...
obviously, right, in the world of investment advice, the folks are trying to operationalize and make efficient and workflows that make everyone sort of more profitable in the end, right?
Yeah, exactly. But there's always, in any situation, there's a positive, even with a situation that could be deemed as a mistake or a failure, there's usually something positive in there. And so I tend to say, start with the positive things, start with the things, the good intentions, start with the things that worked initially before everything went off the rail. And then, then kind of work your way to, okay, where did it start to go wrong? And what did we miss here? And that kind of thing.
Yeah. So speaking of what we missed, we've covered a lot of ground, but what have we missed in our discussion today? Are there things that are deeply important that we didn't get to?
The only thing is that I like to talk about beautiful questions. So that's kind of the label I've been using on my books and a lot of my work. And so that naturally leads to the question, well, what is a beautiful question? So that's totally subjective and it's up to the individual. But I think of a beautiful question as an ambitious question, but it's ambitious, but it's actionable. So it's not so ambitious like, how am I going to create world peace? It's actionable. You want to come up with an ambitious, actionable question that can, if you answer it eventually, could bring about some kind of an important change, maybe in your life, in your business, in someone else's life or business. So I urge people to think about whether they can come up with a beautiful question of their own that could sort of be their own mission question, the thing that would guide them.
Yeah.
So as an example, like my beautiful question, it would be something like, it's changing all the time, and that's okay. But it would be something like, how might I spread the word about questioning? How might I make more people aware of the power of questioning? That's a question that I can't answer like overnight. I can pursue it over time. There's always going to be new things that will come up, new directions I can go in, but it's a nice kind of North Star that guides me. That question, I can be following and chasing that question for a long time.
Yeah. So the question that sparks in my mind, Warren, is this notion of many people at various points in their life might wonder what they'll be remembered for, and what their legacy will be.
Yeah.
And how might someone go about thinking about that question? It's a deeply personal one, but it may have professional overtones too.
Yeah, I think when I was looking at questions around purpose, one of the ones that I borrowed from the writer Daniel Pink, who I think he in turn had borrowed it from someone very famous, which it might have been John Kennedy or someone. There was a question that he asked, which is, what is my sentence? And so the idea is, if you had to sum up yourself or your life in a sentence, what would it be? Write it out. What would it be? It can be a long sentence. It can have 4 or 5 parts to it.
A run-on sentence.
But what it does is it forces you. It's similar to the idea you've heard people say, probably, write your obituary in advance. And so that's a great kind of thing you can do in terms of how you want to be remembered, is to actually, ask yourself, to think, to put it into a statement or a paragraph or something that kind of sums up your life, or what matters to you, or what's important to you. And that really makes you focus in on the important stuff.
Yeah.
Probably a great thing for financial planners to do too, and when they're working with their clients, is to somehow bring that into the conversation. I don't know exactly whether you want to use the what's your sentence question or whatever, but some way, use questioning to get people to really articulate and focus on what really matters to them, what are their values, what do they stand for, what are they about, because that could have a big factor in what they want to do with the rest of their life, where they want resources to go, that kind of thing. It could be tied to values. It could be tied to what they stand for, what they've tried to do in their life. And so you want them to articulate that.
Yeah, and I always find that question works in terms of helping people align their daily activities against that end goal.
Right.
And then you can judge yourself each and every day whether those activities moved you forward or moved you away or you in place.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we did cover a lot of ground. I'm not going to ask you to grade me on my questions.
Oh, your questions were great. And I really like that you dug in at the end there and asked me to go deeper with my own stuff. So that was good. And that's exactly, and you see, when you did that, I was able to talk about something that I wanted to get into the conversation that we hadn't covered yet. And that's why it's such an important thing to do with your clients or whatever, because the chances are, there's going to be something in the conversation that you didn't get to. So give them that opportunity to get that in there at the end.
All right. So before we wrap up, Warren, tell our listeners how they can learn more about you, your website, the books that they could read, etc.
Yeah. So there's a couple of books that are out there. One is called A More Beautiful Question. That's kind of the primer book. That's the first book I wrote on questioning, and it kind of explains why questioning is so important. Tells you lots of these stories about how questioning led to all these amazing breakthroughs, and introduces some of my theories about why, what, if, and how. And then the second book is a little different. The second book is called The Book of Beautiful Questions. And that, in some ways, is a little more practical, because it's got lots and lots of questions in it. So it's basically saying, if you're in this situation, here are 5 questions that might work. If you're in that situation, try these 4 questions. And so it's got, hundreds of questions that are tailored to situations that involve relationship building, or that involve maybe trying to make a difficult decision, or trying to be a better leader. So there are all these questions that are tied to different situations under those headings. And then aside from those 2 books, there's a general website that, you can go to that just has a lot of questioning stuff. Yeah. So if you want to learn more about questioning, there's articles there. There's all kinds of, there's songs that have a question for a title, there's all kinds of stuff.
What's the name of the website?
Anything question related.
What's the name of the website?
The website is amorebeautifulquestion.com.
Great. All right, Warren, this has been a pleasure. I hope you'll come back and join us on another future podcast. But in the meanwhile, this has been really fun for me, and I hope so for our listeners as well.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it. It was a great conversation.
Thank you for listening to the Exceptional Advisor podcast, brought to you by the Investments in Wealth Institute. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe through iTunes, Spotify, or our website at www.investmentsinwealth.org/podcast to get the latest episodes of our Exceptional Advisor podcast series. For additional resources, updates on events, and exclusive membership deals, visit www.investmentsinwealth.org.